mother said it the same way she'd tell a waiter to bring more bread. Casual, almost bored, as if the words had no weight at all. She can eat in the kitchen. She was talking about my daughter, my 7-year-old daughter, who had been sitting in her good dress for 40 minutes, waiting, watching her cousins get settled at the long table in the dining room, the one with the white tablecloth and the good candles, the one that smelled like my childhood and pot roast and Sunday mornings. My daughter was sitting there when my mother came around the corner with a glass of wine already in her hand, looked at the arrangement of chairs, and made that soft little calculation, the kind of calculation I had watched her make my entire life, and set it to the room the way you'd announce the weather. She can eat in the kitchen. There's more space for her out there. 8 adults were at that table or near it. My brother-in-law was pretending to study his water glass. My sister had found something interesting to look at near the window. My father was already in the kitchen refilling the bread basket. Nobody said anything. My daughter lowered her head, her hands flat on the tablecloth, and I watched her do the thing I had watched myself do for 34 years. She accepted. She got up quietly and moved toward the kitchen, because making a scene would have been worse than the kitchen, and she already knew that at 7, which is its own kind of heartbreak. 2 weeks later, my son came home with a box. An old one, the kind with worn cardboard corners and a lid that doesn't sit quite right. He walked it into my mother's living room during the birthday gathering, set it in front of her on the coffee table, and said, "Grandma, this is from Mom." She opened it in front of everyone. What she found inside wasn't a gift. It was a document, and the color left her face so fast that my aunt grabbed her elbow because she thought she was going to fall. I want to tell you what was in that box. But first, I want to tell you how we got there. Because the kitchen chair wasn't the beginning. Not even close. It was just the last one. Our world, the one my daughter and I grew up inside, was Mill Haven, a small town in western Pennsylvania where everyone knows everyone's driveway, which means everyone knows everyone's business, which means silence isn't privacy. It's just deferred gossip. My parents' house was a brick colonial on Aldermore Lane with a green front door that had needed repainting for about 6 years and a dining room that had hosted every holiday my family could name. I grew up in that house. I know every creak in the staircase. I know which burner on the stove runs hot. I know where the ceiling water stain is that my father covered with a painting of a rooster and called it decorating. My mother, Delia, is the kind of woman who believes that appearances are not superficial. They are the point. She has beautiful silver hair she wears in a low bun, and she knows how to enter a room in a way that arranges the room around her without seeming to try. She has 2 children, my sister Gretchen, who is 41 and lives 15 minutes away, and me, Leah, who is 34, which is 2 years younger than Gretchen, 1 town over, and apparently in a different category of grandchild worthiness. My partner, Marcus, is the kind of person who believes that most problems can be resolved if people would just sit down and say what they mean. He is calm in the way that only people who had genuinely stable childhoods can be calm, not performing stability, just being it. He has broad hands and a way of resting one of them on your shoulder that communicates that he's paying attention, that you don't have to say anything twice. When I describe moments like the kitchen chair moment, he listens with his whole face, which is rare. My daughter is named Cora. She is 7, and she has her father's steadiness and my habit of observation, which means she sees everything and says very little, which in a different family would be considered a gift, and in mine was considered convenient. She has dark eyes and a very specific way of holding her cup with both hands that has never stopped being sweet, and she is the reason I did what I eventually did. Not the proximate reason, but the real one. Because watching her learn to expect less felt like watching a door close, slowly, on something that should have stayed open forever. My mother's other grandchildren, the 3 who belong to Gretchen, whose names are Hadley, Bram, and Sweet Chaotic Willa, are loud in the way that is described as spirited by people who love them and a handful by people who are trying to be polite. They sat at the main table. All 3. Even Willa, who had recently established a personal policy of only eating yellow foods. Even Willa. My brother-in-law Gretchen's husband is named Donovan. He is the kind of man who has mastered the art of looking as if he is thinking carefully about something while he is waiting for the moment to pass. I have never once heard him say an unkind word to anyone. I have also never heard him say a true one, when a true one would have cost him anything. If you've ever been the child at the table who got sent somewhere else, not because there wasn't room, but because someone quietly decided that there wasn't room for you, then you already know exactly what my daughter felt when she picked up her fork and moved toward that kitchen. And if you've ever watched your own child learn to absorb that message and go quiet with it, then you know exactly why I did what I did. If you're watching this right now and some part of you is nodding because this is Tuesday, stay here with me. Hit subscribe before you forget, because what happens with that box is the part you're going to want to see, and I'm going to tell you about all of it. If you think sending a 7-year-old to the kitchen while her cousins sit at the white tablecloth table is wrong, give this a like the moment you decide you agree. And leave me something in the comments. Have you ever been excluded by your own family in that specific calm way, the way that makes it harder to explain because there was no shouting? I read every single one. I want to know yours. The rules in my mother's house were not rules exactly. They were more like weather, systems that arrived and departed according to pressures invisible to me. They had the appearance of objectivity. They were consistent enough that you couldn't call them capricious, but they bent in one particular direction always, with such regularity that after a while the bending stopped being noticeable. It was just the natural shape of things. When I was 11 and Gretchen was 13, my mother announced a new policy about birthday parties. Children over 10 would not participate in the organized party games because party games were for the younger kids. This seemed reasonable. I accepted it. When Gretchen turned 13, I watched from the hallway while she played every game at her birthday party. Pin the tail, the one with the balloons between the knees, all of them. When I brought it up later, quietly, because I had learned that directly was always the wrong angle, my mother said, "That's different. She's the birthday girl." I said, "But the rule is about age." My mother said, "Leah, you'll understand better when you're older. I was 11. I filed it somewhere." The way you file things when you are young and cannot yet name what you are experiencing. When Cora was 5 and Hadley was 6, my mother created a new rule. Birthday parties at the house were for family members' immediate household only, to keep them intimate. I thought this meant Cora would be there. We were family, obviously. But when Hadley's birthday party was held at my mother's house that June, Gretchen's whole family was there, plus 3 of Hadley's school friends, plus a woman from Gretchen's pottery class who had brought her daughter along. I had not been told about it. I found out through a photograph my mother posted, the backyard with streamers, all 3 of Gretchen's kids at the picnic table, Hadley in a paper crown. When I called, my mother said the girls from pottery just happened to drop by. The rule apparently applied to me being included, not to other people being added. Rules were her favorite tool. They had the clean face of fairness. The problem was, they were mostly for me. I do not want to make this sound like a legal brief, because it wasn't. There were also real meals and real conversations and moments of genuine warmth. My mother knew every song from the musicals I loved when I was small, and she used to sing them while she cooked Saturday breakfast. She smelled like the same lotion my whole childhood. She tucked things into my backpack on the first day of school every year until I was 12. A small note, a granola bar, once a $1 coin that I kept in a dish on my dresser for 6 years without spending it. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that the injustice was real and the love was also real. And those two things do not cancel each other out. They coexist in ways that make everything harder and more complicated and more true. But the rules were still the rules. And they bent in one direction. Gretchen's 8th birthday. My mother rented a party room at the indoor play complex on Route 9, invited 14 friends, ordered a custom cake from the bakery on Main with a pink fondant horse on top because Gretchen had been asking for a horse all year. My 8th birthday. A cake from the grocery store on Clarkson, 3 friends, the kitchen table with the regular placemats. My mother's explanation, delivered without apology. We had a lot going on that spring. We always seemed to have a lot going on in the springs that were mine. Gretchen's 16th, a used Toyota in the driveway with a red bow. My 16th, a city bus pass, a 30-day card in a small envelope with a card that said, "For your independence." My mother sat across from me when I opened it and said, with what I believe was genuine warmth, "You've always been so self-sufficient, Leah. You never need the fuss." I said thank you and put the bus pass in my pocket. I stood at the corner of Reynolds Street the next morning at 5:46 in the dark in October and waited for the 12 Express. I was self-sufficient. I was also 16 and freezing. Those two things were allowed to be true simultaneously. I'm telling you these things in the order they surface, not the order they happened, because memory doesn't run chronologically. It runs thematically. And the theme running through all of these was a single sentence my mother said at Cora's baby shower, the one she didn't throw but attended, the one Gretchen organized with her friends, and which was genuinely lovely. And I don't want to take anything from that. This sentence came when the gift list was being read, and someone asked which one was from my mother, and my mother said cheerfully, gesturing to the small wrapped box in the pile, "Gretchen and I went in together. You've always been easy, Leah. You never expected a production." She wasn't being cruel. That is what made it land so hard. She believed it. She had told herself the story so many times it had become autobiography. I never expected a production. She was right. I hadn't. In a long time. Because every time I had, the production was withheld and the lesson was delivered. Need less or be disappointed. Over and over until I stopped needing out loud, until the quiet became something she named a virtue, until she believed the story, until I almost did too. The financial piece is the part that is hardest to explain to people who haven't lived it, because from the outside, it looks voluntary. It looks like generosity. It looks like a daughter who loves her family helping out. From the inside, it looked different. From the inside, it looked like a door that started as a crack and became a hallway, and eventually became the route the whole family used without asking whether I needed a hallway in my house. It started when my parents had a rough month. A medical bill, something with the roof, the specific bad luck that comes in threes and usually costs between $4,000 and $12,000. I transferred $1,200 to their account. I had been working for 2 years, and I had savings, and they needed it, and that is what family does when it can. I want to be clear about that. I would do it again, at that moment, knowing only what I knew then. But that was 2017, and by 2021, the transfers had a rhythm. $700 a month to my parents' joint account, which had started covering the mortgage shortfall when my father's business hit a slow stretch. $140 for the utilities top-up. $220 to what my mother called the family fund, a shared account that was supposed to be for emergencies, but had started covering Gretchen's kids' school supply lists, and once, somehow, a replacement dishwasher at Gretchen's house on Fenwick Road, even though Gretchen's household income at that point was higher than mine. When I asked about the dishwasher, my mother explained that Gretchen just needed a hand this month. I said I understood. I did understand. I also understood that nobody had offered to replace the alternator on my car in March, which had cost me $1,600 I didn't have, which was why I had paid it on my credit card and spent 6 months clearing it at $40 a week. But I said I understood, and I transferred the money for the dishwasher, and I went to bed. By early 2023, I was sending $970 a month to 2 accounts I had no meaningful access to. Over the preceding 6 years, the running total I calculated one afternoon in February, sitting on the floor of my bathroom with the banking app and a notepad, was just under $41,000. $41,000. I had transferred more money to my family's accounts than I had in my own savings. My savings, which I needed for Cora's future, for the deposit on a house of our own, for the specific financial safety that every parent wants to build between their child and uncertainty. Gretchen's contribution to any of this, zero, consistently, explained away by the fact that she had 3 kids, and Donovan worked in construction, which slowed in winter, and the house needed the roof fixed, which, and here is the part that stays with me, the roof was fixed using the family fund, which I had been filling for 4 years. I was funding the repair of a house I didn't own so that the family could say they had taken care of it together. I sat on that bathroom floor for a long time. I didn't cry. I did the math twice to make sure I hadn't made an error. Then I sat with the number and waited to feel something large and dramatic, and what I felt instead was quieter than that. A kind of click, like something that had been working too hard finally stopping. That was when I stopped making excuses for them. Not with anger. With arithmetic? The morning after the kitchen chair, after my daughter picked up her fork and walked out of the dining room and sat in the kitchen on a wooden stool at the breakfast bar, where I found her eating pot roast by herself while the cousins' laughter came through the wall in waves. I woke up at 6:43 to sunlight coming through the east window at that low winter angle that turns everything amber, the smell of coffee Marcus had already started, and a sensation I couldn't immediately identify. It took me about 30 seconds to name it. Peace. Not comfort, not relief. The specific peace that arrives when you have finally made a decision and the long internal argument stops. The way an air conditioner you didn't realize was running goes silent and the whole room changes. Marcus was at the kitchen counter when I came downstairs. He looked at me the way he looks when he is reading something carefully. Not with alarm, just with attention. "You made a decision," he said. It wasn't a question. I poured coffee and said, "I'm stopping the transfers. All of them." He said, "Okay." Then he said, "All of them." I said, "Every single one." He nodded once. He did not tell me I was right or wrong. He turned back to his cup. That was more than I needed. I heard Cora come downstairs around 7:30. She came into the kitchen in her socks and looked at both of us with that particular morning assessment children do. Reading the room, checking temperatures, deciding what kind of day this is going to be. I don't know what she saw, but I watched her shoulders drop about half an inch, the way they had not dropped in the dining room the night before, and she said, "Can I have the good cereal?" And Marcus said, "You can have whatever you want." And that was exactly the right answer. She sat at our table, the one at our house, the one nobody had ever told her to leave, and ate cereal with both hands on the bowl, and the kitchen was ordinary and warm, and it felt, in the way that unremarkable mornings sometimes do, like a country I had been trying to get back to for a long time. If my daughter wasn't welcome at that table, neither were we. And neither was my money. I opened the banking app at 9:14 that Saturday morning. I was sitting in the chair by the window in our bedroom, the one with the green cushion that has a small bleach stain on the right armrest from an incident with cleaning supplies that Marcus and I still argue about who caused. The app loaded. I went to the recurring transfer screen. The first was labeled Mom and Dad Joint Mortgage Support. $950 a month. Running since October of 2017. I canceled it. The screen asked me to confirm. I confirmed. The second was labeled Utilities Top-Up Aldermore, $120. Running since March 2018. I canceled it. The screen confirmed. I moved to the third. The third was the Family Fund. $220 a month into a shared account that had been opened in both my name and my mother's. I canceled the automatic contribution. Then I transferred the current balance that represented my portion, $1,200, which I had calculated the previous night using statements going back 8 months, back to my own account. The transfer completed in a second. 1 second. I thought of the dishwasher on Fenwick Road. I thought of the 4 new tires Gretchen's SUV had gotten out of that account in the autumn. I thought of Willa's birthday party, which had been catered, and for which I had bought a gift separately and been thanked with the particular warmth my mother reserves for Gretchen's side of the room. 5 years of obligation in 3 cancellations and a biometric scan. The screen returned to the home menu. The home menu showed my account balance, which was now $1,200 higher than it had been 8 minutes earlier, which was the most it had been in longer than I could easily remember. I also canceled the supplementary card that had been added to my credit account 3 years ago at my mother's request to cover family incidentals, a phrase that had covered a weekend at a bed and breakfast in Vermont and 2 spa appointments since its creation. The card went dormant. The account, mine again. If my daughter wasn't welcome at that table, my money wasn't welcome at that house. I did not feel triumphant. I felt like someone who had finally taken a coat off indoors, after hours, in a room that had been too warm the whole time. The box was Marcus's idea originally. Or rather, he came to me one evening with a folder he had organized and said, "I think it's time Cora knows she was seen." I read what was in the folder. I sat with it for a week. Then I asked my son, my brother's child, 12-year-old Henry, who had been staying with us for the weekend and who would do anything for $20 and a slice of pizza, if he'd be willing to be the one who brought the box into the room. Henry is the kind of kid who appreciates the drama of a well-executed moment. He said yes before I finished explaining. The box itself was an old one, the kind of cardboard that has aged to tan, with reinforced corners and a lid that fits with just enough resistance to make opening it feel deliberate. I found it in the storage closet at the back of our garage. Marcus cleaned it out and lined it with a sheet of tissue paper. Inside the box was a document, specifically a copy of the trust my mother-in-law, Nora, Marcus's mother, a retired civil attorney who lives 60 miles north in Garrett County, had executed 9 months prior at my request, which had been quietly in progress since the previous spring. The document established an education trust for Cora in the amount of $22,000, funded jointly by Nora and Marcus's uncle, whose name appears on the document, whose signature is notarized on 3 pages, and whose quiet support for my daughter stretches back to the day she was born. Because Nora saw, at every family gathering she attended, what was happening, and said nothing for years, and then decided that saying nothing was a form of compliance she was no longer willing to participate in. Under the trust document was a letter. I wrote it myself. I printed it on plain paper. I did not shout in it. I stated facts in the order they occurred, without embellishment and without performed emotion, the way you would file a report. I included the dollar amount I had transferred over 6 years. Rounded down, I rounded down because I wanted to be accurate, not dramatic. I included the date of the kitchen chair incident. I included a photograph of Cora sitting alone at the breakfast bar, taken by Marcus from the doorway, which I had not known he was taking until he showed it to me the next morning. The image of my daughter eating by herself in a house where her cousins were laughing through the wall. The last paragraph of the letter was addressed directly to my mother. It read, "Cora didn't need a grand gesture from you. She needed a chair at the table. Since we couldn't count on that, someone else provided something more lasting." I folded the letter. I placed it under the trust document. I put the lid on the box. I sealed it with a single strip of tape across the top. I did not write my name on the outside. She would know. Henry carried the box in during the birthday gathering. Not the original birthday, a different one, a cousin's birthday 6 weeks after the kitchen chair incident. Because Nora had suggested we wait for a moment of maximum gathering, a moment when the family was assembled and comfortable and expectant, when my mother would be at the center of the room in the way she liked to be at the center of a room. Henry set it in front of her on the coffee table. He said with complete composure, "Grandma, this is from Mom." He had practiced. He was excellent. He retreated to the kitchen and ate half a tray of brownies in professional silence. My mother opened the box in front of everyone. I watched her lift the lid and look at the trust document without comprehending it for the first several seconds. The way you look at a form from an institution, and your eyes scan for context before they find meaning. Then she found the meaning. Her face changed. It went from expectant to confused to something that was not anger yet, was the thing before anger, the white phase before the heat arrives. She lifted the photograph of Cora. She looked at it a long time. Then she set it down on her knee and looked up, and the color had left her face with such totality that her sister, my Aunt Renee, put a hand on her elbow. Nobody said anything in that room for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then my mother said, in a voice that was trying to be controlled and not quite managing, "What is this?" And I was not there to answer. That was deliberate. I was at home with Marcus and Cora at our table eating sandwiches. My phone was on the counter. I had been expecting it to ring. It rang at 2:17. The house was quiet in the particular way that houses are quiet when the people in them are not moving. Marcus had taken Cora to the park after lunch, not as an exile, but as a declaration. We are allowed to have a good afternoon. The sunlight had moved to the west side of the house, coming through the kitchen window at a low angle that lit the wooden table edge in a way I had always found beautiful and never mentioned to anyone. I sat with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and I waited. When the phone rang, it was my mother's number. I answered on the 3rd ring. "What is this?" she said, the same sentence from the living room, still trying to be controlled. I said, "You know what it is." She said, "You went behind my back and you let Marcus's mother do this. For Cora. Without telling me." I said, "I established an education fund for my daughter with the help of people who wanted to help her. That's what it is." She said, "You made me look in front of everyone, Leah. You did this in front of..." I said, "Mom, Cora ate in the kitchen." She stopped. The pause was approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "There wasn't room." I said, "There was room for Willa. Willa is 2 months younger than Cora." Another pause. Then she said, and this is the sentence I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. The sentence that revealed the whole architecture of the thing. "It's not the same." I said, I know. I said, that's the problem. And that is why the money is gone, and why Cora has a trust fund now, from people who looked at her and saw her. She started to say something else. I said, I love you, Mom. I'm going to hang up now. She said, Leah, don't you dare. I hung up. The silence after it was the most complete I had ever felt. Not the silence of tension or suspension. The silence of something finished. I sat in it for a long time. Outside the window, a car passed slowly down our street. A dog barked twice and then stopped. My cold tea was still in front of me, and I picked it up and drank it, and it was cold and I didn't care. And for the first time in a long time, silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like space. By Sunday morning, the campaign was running. This is the thing about close families. They have systems. The phone calls started coming in waves. My Aunt Renee first, who loves me and was genuinely distressed, and whose call I answered because she deserved that. She said, Your mother is very upset, Leah. I said, I know, Aunt Renee. She said, This is a family matter. I said, I agree. That's why I handled it within the family. A pause. She said, She didn't mean, I said, Aunt Renee, Cora ate dinner alone in the kitchen while all of her cousins were at the main table. I need you to sit with that for a minute before we talk about what my mother meant. She sat with it. She said very quietly, That wasn't right. Those 3 words were not a lot. They were almost everything. My cousin Dana called to say she had heard I had done something with a box and wanted to know what was happening. I gave her 2 sentences of summary, neutral, factual. She said, Okay, wow. She didn't call back. Gretchen texted a paragraph that was, at its core, a list of all the things my mother had done for me over the years, which was accurate and beside the point simultaneously. I responded, I know. I've also transferred $41,000 to her accounts over the last 6 years. There's more context than you probably have. She didn't respond to that for 8 hours. When she did, it was one word. How much? I said, 41,000. I have records going back to 2017. Another hour of silence. Then, I didn't know. I said, I know you didn't. That was true. It was also part of the problem that this had been allowed to be invisible for so long that the person benefiting from it most directly had no idea it was happening. The family friend who had known my mother since the 90s, a woman named Pauline, who I had called Aunt Pauline until I was 12, and who still has my school photo from 5th grade on her refrigerator, called to say she couldn't believe I would do something like this to Delia. I told Pauline calmly that I loved her, that the situation was more complicated than she knew, and that I was not in a position to discuss it at this time. Pauline said, Your mother is beside herself. I said, I believe you. I did not say anything else. Pauline seemed to expect an argument and found nothing to push against, and eventually the call ended with a confused sort of formality. The most distant person in the family, a great uncle of mine, an elderly man named Porter who lived in Cape May and called my parents twice a year and me once a decade, somehow heard what had happened and called my mother, and later called me. His version of events, which he had assembled from 3 separate telephone sources, was garbled enough to be almost fictional. But when I gave him my version, briefly and without drama, he was quiet for a long time and then said, Well, a child belongs at the table. He was 81 years old and lived alone, and I had not spoken to him in 4 years. He had the clearest red in the family, as it turned out. The calls tapered by Tuesday. I stopped answering the ones I could predict. The ones I couldn't predict were usually fine. The invoice arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after the birthday gathering, in a standard business envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. Harlan Event Services, LLC, which was the catering company my mother had hired for Hadley's birthday the previous year, the one that had been paid out of the family fund. My name appeared in the billing contact field, which I can only assume had been placed there at some point when I was still a signatory on the shared account, before I had thought to remove myself entirely. Or perhaps it had always been there, a contingency measure I had never noticed, the way certain clauses exist in documents until someone needs them. The invoice was itemized, $38.50 for the appetizer spread, $90 for the main service. A late charge of $42 that had accrued for 6 weeks. Total due, $170.50. Due on receipt. my name at the top. I stared at it for a full minute, not because I was going to pay it. I was trying to understand the logic, the specific sequence of thoughts required to send this document to the person who had just canceled the automatic transfers, as if the cancellation had not happened, as if the terms had not changed, as if the invoice had the power to reinstate what I had ended. I concluded that it did not reflect logic so much as reflex. When the mechanism stops working, you try the same switch again. I called Harlan Event Services, LLC on Friday morning. A woman named Bethany answered. She sounded tired in the way that people who work in billing sound tired. The tiredness of dealing with other people's disputes all day. I told her my name. I told her I had received an invoice. I told her I was not, and had never been, the account holder responsible for this event, that I had been placed in a billing contact field I had no knowledge of, and that I would need my name removed from the account records. She said she would need to verify some information. I provided it. She put me on hold for 3 minutes. She came back and confirmed that the account primary was listed as Delia Harmon, my mother's maiden name, which she uses for some accounts which I had not known. She said she would remove my name from the billing contact. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Have a good day." I said, "You too, Bethany." I hung up. I did not pay the $170.50. I did not send a letter. I did not call my mother to tell her it hadn't worked. I set the invoice on my desk as a paperweight for about a week, and then recycled it on a Tuesday when I was doing the rest of the paper. This is why they liked the arrangement, I thought, as I walked the recycling bin to the curb. They had made their choices and put them in my name, and for 6 years I had carried them as if they were mine. The mechanism only worked because I had agreed to be part of it. The moment I stopped agreeing, the mechanism failed. The invoice was evidence of the mechanism failing. I was not sorry about that. They came on a Saturday morning about 3 weeks after the banking app. I heard the car in the driveway, my mother's gray Volvo, which needs a new muffler and announces itself, and looked out the bedroom window and saw her getting out, and Gretchen getting out of the passenger side, and Donovan getting out of the back, which surprised me because Donovan usually makes an effort not to be involved in anything that might require him to say something definitive. I went to Cora's room first. She was at her desk drawing something with colored pencils, some kind of elaborate city with very specific windows. I said, "Hey, your grandma's here with Aunt Gretchen and Uncle Donovan. They're going to come in and we're going to have a conversation, and I want you to go to your room and put your headphones on and keep drawing. You are not in trouble. Nothing that is about to happen is your fault or your problem. Okay?" She looked at me. She said, "Is it going to be loud?" I said, "Probably not, but I want you comfortable." She said, "Can I have a snack?" I said, "Take the whole box of crackers." She took the box and went back to her desk and put her headphones on. I kissed the top of her head. I went back downstairs. Marcus was already in the living room, standing near the kitchen doorway. He did not look alarmed. He looked the way he looks when he is thinking about something. I opened the front door before they knocked. My mother was on the porch with her purse against her chest like a shield, and Gretchen was next to her with the particular expression she wears when she has been asked to be somewhere she didn't entirely choose, and Donovan was on the porch step, 1 foot lower than the rest of them, as if preserving the option to retreat. I said, "Come in." They came in. My mother started while she was still in the entryway. "I want to understand what happened," I said. "Sure, let's sit down." We sat. Me in the armchair, Marcus beside me on the ottomans they'd brought from the hallway, my mother on the couch, Gretchen next to her, Donovan on the edge of the armchair, diagonal from mine, with his elbows on his knees like a man at a press conference. My mother said, "You embarrassed me in front of the whole family." I said, "Mom, Cora ate dinner alone in the kitchen while Hadley, Bram, and Willa sat at the main table. I want to start there, because that's where I started." She said, "There wasn't room at the—" I said, "There was room. You made choices about who sat where. That was one of them." She said, "You've always taken things the wrong way. Leah, you have always—" I said, "Can I tell you about the money?" That stopped her. I told her about the money. I told her the total. I told her the monthly breakdown. I told her about the dishwasher on Fenwick Road. I told her about the catering invoice that had appeared in my name for an event I had not attended. My mother's face changed through several registers. Disbelief, which was performative. Recognition, which was real. and something that came after recognition, which I can only describe as the expression of a person who has been confronted with arithmetic they cannot argue with, Gretchen said quietly. I didn't know she was sending that much. My mother said, Leah, it was family. I said, yes, it was, and family, apparently, had very different rules depending on whose name was on the transfer. Donovan said, now, let's all... and then stopped, because there was nothing useful for him to add, and he seemed to know it. My mother said, you embarrassed me. You used that child to make a scene. I said, I used a trust fund to make sure my daughter has a future. Those are different things. I said, what you did at that table with the kitchen chair was not a small thing, Mom. Cora is 7. She understood exactly what it meant. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just accepted it. And I cannot watch my daughter learn to accept less. The room was quiet. Gretchen was looking at the table. Donovan was looking at his hands. My mother was looking at me with an expression that was not quite the face she usually uses. Not the managing face, not the rearranging face. Something older than that. Something she had not planned to arrive wearing. My mother said, you don't know what it is to manage a family? I said, I know what it cost me to help manage yours. I said, I'm not looking for a fight, Mom. I'm describing what happened. What I did was stop funding an arrangement that didn't include my daughter. What Nora did was provide what I couldn't guarantee, the knowledge that someone was paying attention. My mother said, Nora, Marcus's mother. Her voice had a particular quality on those 2 words. I said, she watched Cora for years, Mom. She watched and she did something about it. My mother stood up. She said, you will regret this. I said, I don't think I will. She said, family is the only thing that matters in the end. I said, I agree with you. That's why I'm protecting mine. She walked to the door. Gretchen stood and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. Not guilt exactly, but its neighbor. Some awareness of something she had been successfully not seeing for a long time. She said at the door, Leah, and then didn't finish the sentence. I said, Gretchen, I don't blame you, but I need you to know what the weight was. She nodded once. They left. Donovan, on the way out, turned and looked at me and said, and I did not expect this from him, ever, you were right to stop. He said it quietly, the way people say things they have needed to say for a while. Then he went to the car. I closed the door, softly. The click of the latch was the only sound. I stood with my back to the door for about 30 seconds. My hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, not from anger, just the body completing a process the mind had already finished. After about 10 seconds, the trembling stopped. I heard Cora's chair upstairs, the creak of it, then the creak of the floor as she crossed to her doorway. She appeared at the top of the stairs with her crackers and her colored pencils and her headphones around her neck. She looked down at me. She said, "Are we in trouble?" I climbed the stairs. I crouched to her level. She was standing on the landing, slightly above me still, which meant we were eye to eye. I said, "We are not in trouble. None of what just happened is your fault, and none of it is your problem. What it is this. I made some choices that are going to make things different for a while, and some people were upset about those choices, and they came to tell me so. That's all." She said, "Were they yelling?" I said, "No, nobody yelled." She said, "Did you yell?" I said, "No." She thought about this. She said, "Was Grandma sad?" I said, "I think so, yes, and I hope that over time that changes. But right now the most important thing is this. You are not in trouble. Nothing in this house is going to fall on you, and nobody is ever going to send you to the kitchen again while everyone else sits at the table. That's a promise from me to you." She looked at me for a moment with those dark, considering eyes. Then she said, "Okay," and she went back to her drawing. And I watched her, and she was lighter, and I understood that this was exactly why I had done all of it. 6 months passed. The maple in our backyard turned orange and then lost its leaves and left that particular skeletal shape against the November sky that always looks to me like something that used to be something else. Cora went back to school in September with a backpack she'd chosen herself. Dark green with a small patch on the front she had ironed on, a tiny fox, and came home the first day talking the entire time from the car to the front door without stopping about her teacher and a boy in her class who could make very realistic frog sounds and the specific number of crayons in the classroom's supply drawer, which she had counted. She was humming. She had stopped humming for a while, somewhere in the long middle of the difficult period. I had not noticed it leaving, but I noticed it returning. The house was different in a way I found difficult to explain to people who asked. Not quieter, lighter, as if a background noise had stopped. Something so constant I had stopped hearing it as noise and heard it as baseline, and now that it was gone, the silence had texture, and the texture was rest. Marcus and I had coffee on the back porch in the mornings when the weather allowed it, something we had talked about doing for years and always found a reason not to. The reason, I think, had been the low-level fatigue of living under an obligation that leaked energy the way a slow faucet drip wastes water, constantly, invisibly, in amounts too small to seem significant until the moment you look at the utility bill. The money that had been going out was now staying in. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. By November, we had enough to replace the washing machine. The old one had been making a sound Marcus described as a helicopter inside a dishwasher for about 8 months, which we had been tolerating. And to begin, quietly, the process of getting a mortgage pre-approval for a house of our own. A house where Cora would have her room painted whatever color she chose, where the ceiling would be fixed the first time it cracked, where the table would always have a seat for her. We drove by 3 houses that autumn. We had not done that before. My mother's texts still arrived, less frequently than in September. They had shifted register, from accusation to something that was trying to be conversation with varying success. I answered briefly, not coldly, but briefly. I was not performing forgiveness. I was also not performing estrangement. I was making a decision about where my energy went, the same way I was making decisions about where my money went, and the process felt related, like the same muscle, slightly different application. I heard through my cousin Dana, who had quietly become an unlikely ally in the intelligence-gathering sense, that my mother had taken a part-time position at a local real estate office doing administrative work. This was new. My mother had not worked outside the house in 14 years. Dana mentioned it with a certain delicacy that suggested she was watching for my reaction. I said, "Good for her." I meant it. I had never wanted her to struggle. I had wanted her to stop pretending that the way things had been arranged was fair. Gretchen, from what I gathered through the same channels and one careful conversation with Donovan in a parking lot outside a hardware store where we had both, accidentally, gone for the same bag of sand for the walkway, Gretchen had taken on more financial responsibility at home. Donovan had picked up additional contracts. The transfer from me had been covering, apparently, a shortfall that neither of them had ever deeply reckoned with because it had always been invisibly plugged. When the plug came out, they reckoned with it. They were fine. Of course they were fine. They always had been. They had just preferred the arrangement that didn't require them to prove it. "They managed," I said to Marcus one evening. "They always could have." He said, "You already knew that." I said, "I needed to see it." He said, "Yeah." He turned the page of his book. The kitchen was quiet. Cora's reading lamp was on upstairs. The helicopter dishwasher washer was gone, and the new one ran without comment, which felt daily like a small luxury. I sat with the knowledge that the people I had been subsidizing were fine, not thriving spectacularly, not struggling, and I held both feelings at once, the satisfaction that they were okay, and the exhaustion of knowing I had carried their okayness unnecessarily, and I let both feelings be true without resolving them into each other. Some things don't resolve. They just become part of the picture. Gretchen called on a Tuesday in October, 3 months after the front porch visit. Not in crisis, not with an agenda I could detect. She called the way people call when they have been thinking about something for a long time and have finally found a way to begin it. She said, "I didn't know about the money." She said it slowly, as if she were reading it off something she had written to practice. I said, "I know." She said, "I mean, I knew you helped Mom and Dad. I didn't know the amount. I didn't know it had been going on like that." I said, "I know." She said, "And Donovan's been asking me. He said I needed to call you." I said, "He told me it was the right call. In the parking lot." She laughed. The first time she had laughed with me in a long time. "The sandbag parking lot," she said. "Yeah, he told me." A pause. Then she said, "I don't know what to do with it all. Knowing, like, what do I do with that?" I said, "You don't have to do anything with it, Gretchen. I'm not keeping score. I just needed you to know." She said, "Was it always like that?" I said, "The money, only the last 6 years. But the other stuff, yeah, pretty much always." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'm sorry, Leah." I said, "Thank you. I meant it. It wasn't everything. It was enough to be going on with." I hung up and Marcus asked how I felt. I said, "Steady." He nodded. We watched television. Cora came down for a glass of water and went back up. The house was ordinary in the way I had spent years wanting it to be, and ordinary, I had discovered, was what joy often looked like from the inside. The conversation happened on a Sunday in December. I had not planned it. I had gone to my parents' house to pick up a box of old books my mother had set aside for me, a collection of paperbacks that had lived on the bottom shelf of the hallway bookcase my whole childhood, things she'd been meaning to give me for years. It was a deliberate gesture, the kind of small domestic peace offering that functions as an opener. I recognized it. I accepted it. My father was in the garage when I arrived, which is where he goes when things in the house are in a register he doesn't know how to navigate. He was at the workbench with a set of screwdrivers that did not appear to need anything done to them, but the organizing of them seemed to be providing him comfort. I sat on an old camping stool near the door. The light in the garage was the color of weak tea. We didn't say anything for a minute, which with my father is fine. He has never needed words to be present. Then he picked up a photograph. It was on the shelf near his workbench in an old frame with a scratched corner. A photo of him as a boy, maybe 9 or 10, standing in front of a house that wasn't the house on Aldermore Lane. A different house, a smaller one. He held it for a moment and then set it face down on the workbench, which was not a casual gesture. He said, "My mother had a favorite." He said it the way people say things they have never said out loud before. Not dramatically, but with the particular weight of something lifted from where it had been stored for decades. He said, "It was my brother, Dennis. Always was. I didn't. That was how things were." He picked up a screwdriver and put it down. He said, "I don't think your mother ever thought about what she was doing. I think she was just doing what she knew." He didn't say, "And that makes it okay." He just said that. And I believed him. Not as an excuse, as information. As context for a human being who was not a monster and who had done damage anyway, because damage doesn't require a monster. Damage just requires a pattern that nobody examines. I said, "I believe you, Dad. But knowing that doesn't undo what happened to Cora, or to me." He said, "I know it doesn't." He said, "I'm sorry." He said it quietly and without performance, and it landed the way real apologies land. Not like a resolution, but like a door opening on a room that had been sealed. I said, "What matters is what happens now." He nodded. He said, "Your mother has an appointment with someone to talk to, starting in January." I said, "That's good." He said, "She's not happy about it." I said, "She'll be less unhappy once she starts." He almost smiled. We sat in the garage for a while longer. He told me about the screwdrivers, something about a set his uncle had given him, a particular German brand with handles that hadn't changed in 60 years. I listened. The light changed angle. When I left, I took the box of books and he patted my arm twice at the door. And I drove home. The family wasn't fixed. Families don't fix the way machines do. A bad part replaced, the thing running clean. They fix the way bones do. Slowly, imperfectly, stronger at the fracture under pressure, aching sometimes when the weather changes. My mother's first appointment was in January. By March, she had settled into something that was not transformation, but was different. The particular different of a person who has been made to look at the architecture of something for the first time and found that some of it was not what they would have chosen if they had chosen consciously. She was quieter. Occasionally, she said things that sounded like they had been examined before being spoken. We had a phone call in April that lasted 20 minutes and was, by the standards of our history, Remarkable mostly because it contained no subtext, just conversation, the way it was supposed to be. I kept the letter I wrote, the original, before I printed the copy that went in the box. I folded it and put it in a small wooden box Marcus made for me. He is not a woodworker by training, but he made it on a Saturday with a handsaw and sandpaper, and it is imperfect in the way handmade things are imperfect, with a lid that has to be set at a slight angle to close. The letter is in that box, on the shelf in our bedroom, next to a photograph of Cora at the beach from last summer. Her back to the camera, arms out, hair in the wind, the particular posture of a child who does not suspect she is being watched. I also kept the bus pass, not the original. That was lost years ago in some move or other. But a transit card I found in a box of old things while we were packing for the house we eventually bought. We closed in March, a place on Darrow Street, 2 stories, with a yard and a room for Cora that she painted a very specific shade of green she chose from a fan of color samples with great seriousness. The transit card is not the one from my 16th birthday. It is just a card I found. But I kept it anyway because it represents something I want to keep near. Who I was at that bus stop at 5:46 in the morning. 16 years old, standing in the cold, going to a future that felt very far away. I carried myself there. I want to remember that. The car is not a metaphor. It is a car. A used one, reliable, with a heated driver's seat that Marcus found for me specifically because I am always cold, and with the kind of trunk space that lets you bring groceries and also camping gear, and also a child's bicycle disassembled in the back without having to choose. It is mine. I paid for it with the money I saved when the transfer stopped. Not the whole car, the down payment. The rest is a loan I am paying off, in amounts that are manageable, because the $970 a month I was sending somewhere else is now going somewhere intentional. The car is not the point of the story. The car is the receipt. The proof that when someone stops being drained, they can build. I wanted you to know that not as a triumph. I don't feel triumphant when I drive it. I feel ordinary. Ordinary in the way of a person who has finally stopped spending more than they have. I want to talk to you for a minute. If you've stayed here this long, and you have, and I'm glad, I want to say something directly, the way I would say it if we were sitting somewhere and you had just told me your version of this. If you grew up as the child who got less, I don't just mean money, although sometimes it was money. I mean less attention, less celebration, less of the specific warmth that tells a child they matter in full, and not just conditionally. If you grew up in a house where the rules had exceptions, and the exceptions were never for you. If you sat at a smaller table, or in a different room, or waited at the window while a different kind of day happened for someone else. If you learned to call yourself self-sufficient because the other option was to be disappointed, and being disappointed felt worse. If you have said, "I'm fine" so many times that you started to believe it meant something about you, rather than something about the arrangement, this is for you. You weren't hard to love. You were easy to overlook. Those are not the same thing, and I need you to hear that distinction clearly because I spent a long time confusing them. Easy to overlook is about the people doing the looking. Hard to love is about you, and it was never about you, what you did to survive. The smile at the table when the gifts were unwrapped. The thank you said for things that hurt. The way you made yourself smaller so the family fit together without the friction of your needs. That was not weakness. That was a child doing the only thing available to her. But you are not a child anymore, and the smallness is not required. You are allowed to take up the space you actually occupy. You are allowed to have a chair at the table. If the table doesn't have one for you, you are allowed to stop funding the table. Someone saw you. Maybe it was a grandmother who drove an hour to every recital and never mentioned the ones they missed. Maybe it was a teacher who wrote a note in your margin that wasn't about the assignment. Maybe it was a neighbor who asked about your day and actually waited for the answer. Hold on to that person. The fact that someone saw you in the middle of all the not seeing is not a small thing. It is evidence that you were worth seeing. You are always worth seeing. I am Leah Wallace. I live in a house on Darrow Street with a man who noticed that I was always cold and found me a heated seat. I have a daughter who paints her room green and counts crayons and hums while she does her homework. I drive a car I paid for with money that used to go somewhere it wasn't valued. I have a letter in a handmade box on a shelf. I have a transit card I keep for reasons I understand, even when I can't explain them to someone else. I am 34 years old and I am not finished, but I am steadier than I have been, and I am building something that belongs to me. The relationship with my mother has a rule now. One rule. When a conversation starts to move toward the old pattern, the minimizing, the reframing, the comparison, I say, "Mom, I'm going to say goodbye now." Then I do. She tested the rule once in February, sliding back into the register of, "You've always been the stronger one," with that particular warmth that used to make me stay past the point I should have. I said, "Mom, I'm going to say goodbye now." I hung up. She called back in 4 minutes. We talked for 10 minutes about the books I'd been reading and whether the spring would be early. That was a better conversation. It was better because it was honest, and it was honest because she knew I would leave if it stopped being so. It's not a perfect family. Families don't become perfect. They become different. And different, when the direction is right, is enough. Different can hold 2 people on a phone talking about books. Different can hold a garage conversation about a photograph. Different can hold the knowledge that a chair at a birthday table cost more than anyone calculated, and that it didn't have to. I'm in the car on a Tuesday morning in April. The light through the windshield is the particular gold of spring mornings that last about 20 minutes before the day becomes ordinary. I have dropped Cora at school. She kissed me on the cheek and grabbed her green backpack and ran, which is the correct way to leave a car when you are 7 and you have places to be. I'm in the parking lot of the office where I work, and I have 5 minutes before I need to go in, and I am sitting with the engine off, holding the keys. On the keyring is a small tag, the paper kind with the reinforced hole, the kind that gets tied to things in shops. My mother-in-law Nora tied it there last Thanksgiving. Her handwriting is extremely small and extremely neat, the handwriting of a woman who has spent decades reading legal documents and has very little patience for ambiguity. On the tag, in her handwriting, is a sentence, "You were always worth it." I have read it approximately every day since November. It doesn't get smaller. I don't know if it will. I think this is what I would have needed to hear when I was 16, standing at the bus stop at 5:46 in the morning, believing that self-sufficient was what I was, instead of what I had been required to be. I would have needed someone to put it in writing, in very small, neat handwriting, somewhere I could read it again. I have it now. It's enough. And if you're watching this, if you made it all the way here, and something in this story sounded like your story, or your child's story, or the story you watched from across a table while nobody said anything, I want to ask you 2 things. First, have you ever been the one who funded the arrangement, the one whose transfers kept the lights on for people who had a different seat at the table? Tell me. I want to read it. I want you to say the amount out loud if you know it, because saying it out loud is the beginning of understanding what it was. And second, what is the thing you kept? The object from the hard time. The receipt of who you were when the future was still far away. Tell me what you kept and why. If you think sending a child to eat alone while her cousins sit at the main table is wrong, and I think you do, I think that's why you're still here, then that's what the like is for. Press it. It says what a lot of words don't quite reach. And subscribe, because what happened at Christmas, what my mother did and what Cora said about it, which was the most 7-year-old thing anyone has ever said, which made Marcus laugh so hard he spilled his coffee. That is the next chapter. And I promise you, the next chapter is not what anyone expected, including me. You were always worth it. Whoever told you otherwise, they were wrong. The arithmetic proves it.